Hello, it's Duncan. Our Gilded Rose application is represented by a class, and its constructor takes the information required to construct its dependencies, such as the path to the stock file and the URL of the external pricing service. In some ways, this keeps our integration tests honest. They have to work with the concrete types of the production dependencies. But as we'll see today, it also means that tests for any aspect of the integrated app have to deal with the behavior of the production code. We're about to enter the expand phase of an expand contract refactoring. Our app is going to read and write from both the stock file and a database, in order that we can migrate from the file to the database without drama. But that means the production behavior is going to be temporarily quite complicated, which in turn will mess with our tests. Instead of asking all integration tests to cope with this, in this episode we end up refactoring our app class so that its dependencies are passed in. Injected, if you will. Okay, can't put it off any longer, here we go. This is our app, and this is where we build our stock file items. So what we need to do in order to deploy our DualItems, the one that also uses the database, is to create a DualItems in here. And that will take our stock file items as its source of truth, and it will take a DB items given some DSL context that we don't know how to do yet, and the analytics to report any discrepancies. Now this doesn't compile, and doesn't compile because stock wants an items that has no transactions, but our DualItems is an items with our database transactions. So we need to make stock compile, and it would be nice if it didn't really depend on the type of this transaction at all. So we should really be able to use star in there. But if we do, then this doesn't compile here. Now when that happens, it's normally a or contravariant sort of issue. So I'm going to go to items and say, we should be able to deal with subtypes of our TX context. And dealing with subtypes is an out. Now we might try in, but in the case of in, you see here it says this doesn't compile. We needed an out. So that's an easy decision. So that's our out. And now we go back to our stock. But it still doesn't compile. And if we look at the error message here, it says, I'm looking for context of Kotlin nothing here. That's a bit confusing. It turns out that we can use the base type. The base type is our TX context. And that's happy. It's only happy if this is out. If I build that, you see this outside one doesn't compile. But if I go back to items and make this out TX context, then that does make everything build. I think, personally, that we should be able to use star in there, and there's some issue around context receivers that isn't quite working. But we're making progress. We were left with a to-do in our app here, so let's try and sort that out. What does DB items need? It needs a DSL context. Let's remind ourselves in the tests how we got one of those. So I'm going to go to DB items tests. And here we populate a test environment, and then we've got this test DSL context. This run doesn't seem to be needed. That was a leftover for some time zone work. And so we get our test DSL context by creating a DB config, a Hikari data source from that, and then giving that to this DSL using from Duke. I'm going to put this over here and maximize that one so that we can ask the question, what is it reasonable for our app to depend on? We could pass in a DSL context, which is what DB items needs directly. We could pass an environment and it could go through this code. But it feels to me more like it should be using the middle ground, which was this DB config that we created, which encapsulates the things we need to connect to the database. That feels like the right sort of information to give to app. Now, ironically, that mapping is hidden inside here, So I think what we'll do is we'll take this thing, make a function out of it, and then take this test environment dbconfig as the parameter to that. So if we make that a parameter, that's now our dbconfig. And now we can make that the receiver in order that this is dbconfig to DSL context. And then if I take this and take it out of here and put it into configuring, make it public, we can go back to the tests and import that. And then in here we could say if we had a dbconfig, then we could call to DSL context on it. And my thinking here is that the app is managing a lifecycle at the moment, so it should own the DSL context, so that if it needed to shut down the connection pool or that sort of thing, it could do that. Okay, now we don't have a dbconfig for this, so let's create one as a parameter to this constructor. So we'll say add, its name is going to be dbconfig, type is going to be dbconfig, and a default value, well that's a bit difficult, I'm just going to say to do in here. And that's what IntelliJ is going to use in the places we're already calling app. So let's make that refactor and see what happens. That allows us to import that. Now let's just see whether we can compile. Okay, so we've got some unreachable code. Let's have a look at that. And that's where we've got this to do in here. Well, that's quite nice for us. What can we do instead of this to do? Well, again, we've got some of that in our tests. So let's go back to our DB tests. And we could effectively pull this code here into our main. And this is not test environment, but it's our environment. And instead of test DSL context, we want this to be our dbconfig, which is our environment to dbconfig, and is no longer a DSL context. And note that we're hard coding our database parameters in the environment, so they can be pulled out of the dbconfig. For production, we happen to know that we want to be using 5432, the standard Postgres port. The username will probably be Gilded, but we know we're going to override this password from environment variables. Okay, we're getting close. We can pass dbconfig into here. And now where else wasn't building? Now everything builds, but I think we had another place with it to do. Let's find the corners of app. Application events test, so we've got a to do in here. Well, this is in our test tree, so we should probably be using the test dbconfig. We don't actually have one of those, I don't think. We have a test DSL context. So let's pull this out as our test dbconfig. Make that more public. And now in here we can say, when we're using our app events, we want to use test dbconfig. List stock tests. Again a test, so I guess again we'll say test dbconfig. And same issue in our test main, but this doesn't want to be using the unit test database, this wants to be using our local database, which will effectively have the same configuration as our dbconfig from our real main. And then finally smoke test. I think this probably wants to be test dbconfig. This test is disabled, so we're just storing up a problem to solve later. Okay, does that build? Yes, it does. So now let's try running all the tests. Okay, we have a couple of failures. Let's have a look at those. First is list stock test reports errors. Let's have a look at the test. So all we've done is we've set up the app and then we've listed the stock. And it said, you expected there to be a blank name in this case because we'd corrupted the stock file in order to induce an error. But actually you've got a stock list loading mismatch. But that has this blank name inside it. So what's all that about? Well, the problem is that even in these tests, we're now using an app that uses our DualItems. And in our tests, we've configured the stock file, but we haven't configured the database. And the point of our DualItems was it would warn us when these two were out of sync. And in all of our unit tests, they're out of sync. This also means that all of the unit tests, or the sort of integration tests that talk to the app, are also using the database, which means that we have to remember to clear it out before we do anything, and that we can't run these tests in parallel. So this is a bit of a problem for us. And in fact, the other test that fails here, every request raises an event, has the same issue. We're seeing the event that says that this items and this items disagree about the contents. So this app class would be a lot easier to test if it wasn't always building a DualItems. And in fact, that would mean we could test it with an in-memory items for lots of the simple cases. But I don't really want to make the changes necessary to do that on top of all these broken tests. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll back some of those changes, but not all of them. I'm going to keep the ones I think are going to be useful in a minute. So let's look at our commit list. Now the changes to app I think we're going to get rid of. So I'm going to keep that one out of the commit. Application events tests. Well, that was because we changed app, so let's not commit that either. Configuring. That looks like a change we do want because that will allow us to go forward later. I'm going to keep that one. DBItems test similarly. Items, what did we do there? Oh, that was our out. That was useful. List stock tests. This was using our app, so we're going to roll that one back. Main will roll back. Smoke test will roll back. Test main will roll back. But stock here, that was where we changed the type of our context. We want to keep that for later. So in fact, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert these selections. I'm going to roll back the others. So we're going to roll back that one and that one, but not that one, that one, and that one. But we're going to roll back that one and that one and that one, not that one and that one. Phew. Well, let's give that a go. Let's say roll back. Oh, and good old IntelliJ doesn't respect the selection. So now we're going to have to do this by hand. So we want to roll back app and main, but not stock or items. Yes to configuring, no to configuring, and then stock.kt, test main. Is that right? I think it is. So we're going to roll back everything but 1, 2, 3 files. Should be 4 files. What am I missing? DBItems tests. Roll back everything else. Now let's see whether that still builds and passes the tests. Well, that's a relief. I think it's worth committing, and I'm going to call this work in progress on installing DualItems. We won't push this, and we'll probably amend commit in a minute. Okay. So now we're back to app having stock file as a parameter, in fact, property, and then building the stock on a stock file items given that file. But now we want to be able to build a version of the app with the different items. It suggests that stock file isn't the property we want, it's the actual items. But we'd like our current code to carry on compiling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a constructor. And the constructor is going to have the same signature as this and the same defaults. Now it can't actually have the same signature because we'd have 2 constructors with the same signature. So I'm just going to put a dummy in here for now. Let's call this val dummy, which is a boolean, which will differentiate between the 2. And now in here, we're going to call the other constructor. Now, none of these can be vals, so let's take those out. But we copy those and put them in here. We can then add in the commas. And then finally, put in our dummy true. So now everything that was calling the primary constructor will now be calling this secondary constructor. Let's see whether that works. Well, it does, that's good. But now I want the property not to be stock file, but items. So I'm going to call this items, and it's going to be items of some transaction type that we don't care about. So we know we're going to have to call that txContext, and I don't have a default for it. And it's our persistence items. Now we can use that in here. And if I cut that items, I can paste it into here. Does that still pass the tests? Well, no, it doesn't. And the reason is that we have this fixture that supports our testing, and that asks the app for its stock file, and now the app doesn't have a stock file. Why did it do that? Well, let's have a look, see where that's called. It uses it in its own save here, so it saves the stock file. And here we're using it to corrupt the stock file so that we do get an error in the list stock test we had earlier. For now, at least, we can solve the problem by having fixture remember its own stock file. And that's because the fixture always, in fact, creates a stock file in a temporary directory. So I think we should be able to add the type into there. Oh, it says it doesn't know. Well, never mind. I do that by hand and say, you fixture have a stock file. And then in here, this is app copy. This was using the fact that our app was a data class with stock file as one of its properties. We can no longer do that, but we can remember the stock file in our fixture. Let's just see whether that's right. When it compiled at least, let's see what the issues are. Well, those two events tests are giving us trouble again. Let's have a look at reports errors. And a little bit of debugging shows that the issue is that whilst the fixture has a stock file, it's not actually passed it onto the app. So you have to go here, and the fixture now needs to not be calling app copy, but in fact the app constructor, passing it the stock file. Run that, and we're nearly there. And we've now got the issue that we're getting an unexpected API response, 503 client error, connection refused. Why is that? Well, this list stock tests sets up a fake value elf server, and it actually runs it up here. And it has to do that because the only way we can create an app is with the URI to talk to value elf. This is a problem we have because app is creating its own collaborators. In this case, it needs to use the value of URI to create a value of client, and that actually needs to be talking over HTTP. So that's a problem we can solve in the same way as we have just done with the items. We can say that our app has a property, not of the URI that we need to connect to, but of the thing that connects to the URI. Let's remind ourselves of the type of that. It's this thing here. So that's pricing, which is item to price. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a parameter into our constructor. That's now here. And we need to make it a val. I think while we're here, we can now get rid of this dummy because these are now quite different signatures. Let's see whether that builds and runs. Now it feels like we're getting close, but we still have this illegal state exception. And the reason for that, I think, is that in fixture, where we recreate an app here, we lose our pricing. We're going to have to say in here, copy pricing equals the pricing from our app. To see whether that does work. Well, it does, but this is only getting worse quicker than it's getting better at the moment. But we're going to have faith. Let's see if we can simplify our list stock test now we're here. So in order to run, it's having to create this fake server. But I think we could do a lot better now. We could create ourselves an app where instead of using the value of URI, we call pricing, and we just pass it a lambda, where that lambda can look up in this value of pricing. Pricing is item to price. It's going to take an item, and it's going to return lookup in that value of pricing lambda given item.id and item.quality. Now this is still referencing the wrong constructor. So previously we were calling the default constructor. Let's do that and then just call copy on that to give it the pricing. Does that still pass? It does. And given that, I think we can probably not have a server at all, because now we're using our in-memory pricing. Is that true? Yes, it is. So things are getting better. It's now not testing the HTTP client for the pricing, but we have other tests to do that. In fact, I think we might be able to wean this list stock tests off of our fixture altogether. So this one here, we're using the fixture to set up our app, but let's do that by hand instead. So here we say val app equals our app. Now a fixture sets up the initial stock list and it does it on disk for us. But now we can actually use the constructor for app that takes an items, and we can pre-populate those rather than pre-populating something on disk. So go back here and we'll say val items is in-memory items, and we want to apply, and we want to save the stock list. So we'll say save, initial stock list. Now we can't do that for two reasons. One, we need run IO. And the other is we need to say in transaction. Now we can use that items in here, and we can use the pricing from here. And our clock, you can see here we wanted the clock to say same day as last modified. So we can say clock is something that returns same day as last modified. Given that, we can get rid of this. And this is now app.roots. Format that. Is that true? It isn't. I'm just a bit suspicious. That's not initial stock list. We want this stock list from here. Does that run? It does. Good. And now that we have control over items in reports errors, we don't have to go and corrupt the file. We can just install an item that returns an error. So let's take this structure into here. We'll say val items that fails is an object which is items of some sort of transaction. I guess no transaction will do us. Import that, implement that. Now we know we're going to call in transaction and load, so we can pull this out the way. In transaction needs to call the block with no tx, but I suppose we might as well just pass that directly in here like that, and that's the thing we're going to return, and then make it expression body. And then in load, well, the test down here forced a stock loading error blank name. So I think we'll take that into here. And in here, we want to return a failure with the expected error. And I think expected error was a better name. IntelliJ seems to have stopped for a while. Let's carry on going. This is items that fails. This is expected error. Now we can get rid of this. We don't need to write. We've got an expected failure. We're just going to ask the app to load the stock list. And then this is app roots. And then finally we need some events. That again was handled by the fixture for us before. So let's go to the fixture and say we'd like something like that. This is going to be our val events. Our analytics is add to the events. And this is expected error. Reformat. Are we right? Yes, we are. Phew. Now, I'm sure there's quite a bit of tidying up to be done in there, but I'm going to postpone that joy because we weren't here to fix this. We were here to install the DualItems on our app. I think, though, as everything's passing, this feels like a checkpoint we should check in at. And I'm just going to make that an amend commit on our previous work. So we're ratcheting along. Okay. Back in fixture, this is worrying me a bit, the fact that we are building apps and so on. Let's just see where fixture is used. Well, it turns out only in one place now, so I think let's go and kill it in here and then fixture can go all together. So in this case, we're building an app, we're using that to get a fixture, and then we're using the fixture in our tests. We've got uncaught exceptions raise an event, and we're doing that by actually going to a special URL, and every request raises an event, which we're doing by going to the root. Well, I think any old app will do us there. So instead of building an app fixture, I think we'll call this our app. And two things we really need to give it are our items, which can be our in-memory items. I don't think we even need to initialize it in this case. It can be empty. And our pricing, and if we don't have any items, that can return null. So now we can get rid of this and this. Oh, but we do need events. So we're back to saying private val events equals mutable list of any. Our analytics is add to the events. Now we can get rid of that. We talk to our app and get rid of that. Reformat, get rid of that. Talk to our app, get rid of that. Does that pass all the tests? It does. Is fixture unused? This is. Save, delete that. And now fixture is unused. Before we get rid of it, it's worth reminding ourselves that it was there because we had an app that could only work in terms of the stock file items, and we wanted something to make that more convenient for us so that it could manage saving items to that file so that tests were in a particular state and so on. Now our app takes items, we can use that in-memory items for that, which is a lot more convenient. So fixture can go, and I think we can commit that. Again, as an event commit. One to do, where's that? Oh, that isn't really a to-do, that's a thing we don't expect to be called. So I think we should say that is throw not implemented error. Run to check that's okay. It is, and again, amend. Just before we go on, we have done an awful lot of refactoring, and there's nothing like seeing things with your own eyes. So I think I'm going to try, first of all, running that smoke test that we found earlier. Here it is. Let's try see whether that runs. And it does. And then I think we've also got a test main there. Let's try running this up and opening 8088. Oh, and it does actually render. It looks like our stock file is quite out of date given the number of things of negative sell-by dates, but at least our app does start, which is reassuring after all that refactoring. Okay, back to app. I think it's now worth asking who calls this constructor. And the answer is list stock tests. I said we hadn't really finished the job there, so let's save delete that. Then we have main, we have our test main, and we have the smoke test. So those are all plausible. I'm going to commit that little amend to get rid of that last little change. And now finally we're in the position that all of our unit tests called this constructor here, passing in a version of items that won't be affected by our DualItems hack. Oh, and while I'm here, I notice we have this value of URI that we don't need because they'll also be creating their own version of pricing. So we can get rid of that and run all the tests. Good. Okay, now we'll go back through the refactor to add our DualItems rather than stock file items. So this is going to be DualItems, given the stock file items as the source of truth, and DB items, given some context we don't yet have, and analytics. Where do we get this context from? Well, let's pass it in here, say, as the DB config that we saw first time round. And if we had one of those, then we could use DB config to DSL context. Now we could provide a default in here, but we know that it's going to be overridden in production in order to supply a safe password. So let's build that and find what it breaks. And we're back now to saying that when we start up, we need some sort of environment. So this is val environment. We'll go to our DB items test to remind us how that looks. So we've got these sorts of things back into main. So our environment is something like that. This is asking our environment to extract a DB config. And this is our DB config that we can pass into here. Except that when we're not running unit tests, we want to be running on 5432, the standard Postgres port. And now we're building, let's rehearse what we're going to do in production. So we'll check that our dev database has no tables in it. That's good. So we're going to have to apply the migrations. So we did that before. It was jdbc underscore URL equals whatever is true of our production. And shell doesn't like spaces, so put that in there. And then we can say /gradle w flyway migrate, I think. Run that. That was successful. So now if we refresh, we've got tables, items, which is empty. Good. And now if we run our test main, it starts up. and renders properly. Let's have a look at the events. And the very first event you can see here is that we expected the database to have the items in, but it didn't because it was empty. And we look in the items table, it's empty. We could though force them to be saved by setting the last modified in the tab separated file to be yesterday. That would mean that all the stock items had to be updated and they'd naturally be saved back to the database. Let's see whether that's true. We'll go to the TSV file, which is here. And that you can see is last modified today. If I made it yesterday by making that 22 and saving it, and back to Firefox and refresh this page, that still loads okay. And now let's have a look in our database, and lo and behold, all our items have appeared. Now we don't want to do that in production because everything will have aged by an extra day, but the fact that it works suggests that if we install the software as it is, and then wait until after midnight, it will populate our database for us. So I think that may be good to commit. Let's have a look at the last changes. We tidied up the value of URI and started passing dbconfig down so that we can build our DualItems. Well, that's what we expected. In our main, we now create a dbconfig from our environment, where the environment allows us to override things with environment variables so that we can deploy to production with a password that we don't know. And then our smoke test and our test main are changed to compile. Well, I think we might say this is one big commit of installing DualItems. And there appear to be no warnings, so I think we're done. Reviewing this session, I think we certainly have introduced dependency injection to our app class, but it's interesting that in production we actually call this convenience constructor that creates the production dependencies itself. I'm now not very happy with the fact this is a data class. We don't need to copy or compare them. And because this server start down here, there's some hidden state in our class. I think it's something we might want to address later. When we got stuck introducing DualItems and lots of tests failed, I see we use the Mikado method again, reverting changes, reworking a code to fix the underlying problem, and then reapplying the changes. But I messed it up by rolling back some things and then committing. It would have been better to cherry pick the commit and then roll back. On the database front, I wonder if populating the database through the daily stock quality update is too subtle. I feel in a large team it would be more risky, but if it works, it will save some manual intervention and potential downtime. Before we push to production, let's just review where we are. We've completed the expand phase of this refactor. Our app is now going to read and write from both the original stock file and the new Postgres items, but if they disagree or if there are any errors in the database code, it should fall back to the stock file as the source of truth. In order to deploy this code, we are first of all going to need to initialize the database with our migrations, and we can do this at any time before we deploy. We also need to configure the app environment with the URL, username and password of the database held as environment variables. After we deploy, we expect the logs to show that the database disagrees with the stock file until the first request after midnight, after which the items table should be populated and the DualItems should show they agree from then on. We'll be sure to monitor this release carefully to check that it's behaving as we expect and report back next episode. If you'd like to see that episode, then please subscribe to the channel. And if you like what I'm doing here, then I think you'll like the book that I wrote in that price called Java to Kotlin Refactoring Guidebook, details of which are in the show notes below. Thanks for watching.